First of all, I'd just like to defend my good friend and colleague here, Senator Scarr, against those outrageous slurs against him in the prior speech that somehow seemed to think that he was calling manufacturing, people who work in manufacturing, rent seekers. That was completely outrageous, and it's typical of what we have come to expect from the other side, who deal in feelings and fear rather than facts. And for a Queensland Labor senator to come in here and say that she supports manufacturing in the regions is an outrageous statement. Because it was the Queensland Labor Party, who sold the Port of Brisbane, who sold Queensland Rail, Queensland Rail built by Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who opened up the Bowen Basin, which actually built the railway lines that provided the freight, that provided the royalties, that provided the demurrage charges at the ports. That recurring revenue, built by the National Party in the 70s and 80s, provided the money to fund schools and hospitals. Hospitals like a maternity ward in my hometown of Chinchilla that had 4 maternity nurses in the 70s and 80s when I grew up there. Under a Labor government, we don't have maternity wards there in Chinchilla or Biloela or many other towns, including Gladstone. And you know why? Because the Labor government, the Queensland Labor government, has driven Queensland broke. And you know why they did it? Because they flogged off all of our infrastructure built by the Liberal National government of the 70s and 80s that provided recurring revenue to pay for the recurring expenses. They provided jobs in the regions. It wasn't just the Bowen Basin that was opened up, it was the Weipa bauxite deposits. There was value add going there at Gladstone that created jobs there. We built lots of dams, the mighty Burdekin Dam up north, the mighty Wivenhoe Dam. That paid for things like the Captain Cook Express in Brisbane to provide valuable infrastructure. But it wasn't just the Queensland state Labor government that destroyed manufacturing in the state in this country. It was the federal Labor government. And in particular, the Hawke-Keating government and their reckless neo-liberal policies of the 80s, in particular when Paul Keating opened up capital markets to the world in the 1980s. In 1985, we had $8 billion in foreign debt. The banks had borrowed $8 billion in foreign debt. By 2008, we had $800 billion. The banks had borrowed $800 billion in foreign debt, and all of that money, nearly all of that money, went into inflating house prices in Sydney or Melbourne, so that the average house price in Australia had risen from 4 times earnings to approximately, depending on which city you lived in, to between 10 and 12 times earnings. Now, the reason why that matters and capital controls matter is because you need to dictate how money that is borrowed, how it is invested. And when the banks were allowed to pump so much money into residential housing, all that did was inflate housing, but it didn't add to productivity. So it increased demand, but it didn't increase supply. So now we have got this situation in Australia where we're drowning in debt because we've overinvested in consumption, and yes, houses are important, but a house is the same house whether it's valued at $500,000 or $5 million. And because Paul Keating went on this reckless neoliberal ideology spend, we have allowed the foreign banks to drown us out in debt, right? Not to mention withholding taxes, which I'll come to in a minute. But not only that, we then had the Button Plan, which rationalised and did a lot of things that made it very difficult for Australian industry, particularly the car industry, to compete in international markets. Now, no one for a minute is suggesting that we didn't need to reform the industry, but we didn't need to actually destroy the entire car industry. And the groundwork for that, and I'm not going to say either party's blameless in any of this, but when the Labor Party come in here and say that we shut down car manufacturing, that's not true. Nissan and Ford shut down under the Rudd-Gillard government during those years. So we need to get that into context. But not only that, these other policy things like superannuation. So when Senator Scarr talks about rent seekers, he's talking about industries like superannuation that never existed 30 years ago. We have got tens and tens of thousands of financial engineers in this country that do nothing but shuffle paper and pocket fees. They do not create one asset. And I well remember Bob Hawke going out there saying how compulsory superannuation was going to build infrastructure in this country. Well, that was a completely outrageous lie. Superannuation does not build infrastructure. It buys infrastructure. And that is a very significant difference, because if you have these funds, these superannuation funds sit there every week, they don't have to do a thing. They get 12% of the entire workforce, or soon to be 12% of the entire workforce's wage. They don't have to do anything. This is money for jam, right? And what they do is they just pay over the market for existing infrastructure assets. And if they have too much money, which they do now, they don't actually invest here in Australia. They've gone and parked $1 trillion of superannuation offshore. I mean, I think it is one of the Queensland super funds, one of the Queensland public super funds, actually is the biggest shareholder in Heathrow Airport in London. Now, why have we got Australian superannuation funds investing in offshore infrastructure instead of building new infrastructure here? And if we want to get manufacturing back on its feet in this country, we need to go back to the past and look at the way it was done in the past. And let me say this, infrastructure is a monopoly. Infrastructure is a monopoly, and I believe in the private sector, but I don't believe in free markets, and I speak with a great deal of authority when I say that, because no greater a person than Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party, actually says in the last paragraph of the Forgotten People speech, we should not go back to the old and selfish notions of laissez-faire, right? That's very important. What I believe in, and why I'm on this side of the chamber, is because I believe in capitalism, and that is people who risk their own capital. And I don't care whether you're a teacher or a nurse, or a doctor or a lawyer, or an engineer, or a bricklayer, or a mechanic, or a carpenter. If you get out of bed every day and put your nose to the grindstone, you are a capitalist in my books. You are the one risking capital. That's how markets work. They have to rely on the risk-reward paradigm. Okay, and that is why, when it comes to infrastructure and monopolistic infrastructure, I believe that governments should own and build it. And that is why I'm against this fund, because what this fund does is it's going to channel out $15 billion to, as my good friend and colleague Senator Scarr rightly says, to the rent-seeking parasites. The fact of the matter is that small businesses like window manufacturers up in Cairns and that won't have the knowledge to know how to go through all the applications and the paperwork and jump all the hurdles to get the actual handout. I mean, this is the thing. Guys who work in manufacturing, the guys who are on the tools, they can't stand the paperwork. They can't stand the paperwork. What you will have is the professional class of elites, rent-seeking elites, who will know how to work the system. A lot of them will be ex-staffers and all that, and lobbyists who do nothing but grease the wheels. Nothing but grease the wheels of sucking money out of the system. And by the way, I don't disagree with Senator Whish-Wilson. I never agreed with a lot of the slush funds we set up either. Right? I mean, either you own it and you build it, right? You operate it and you're held accountable for it, or you let the market deal with it, provided the people that participate in the market are risking their own capital. And that is why I hate superannuation, because you've got this whole industry out there gambling with other people's money. And that's not right. And I should add in that most corporations, large corporations especially, aren't capitalists either. They're socialists. The executives that run those corporations, they get paid millions of dollars, and when they drive those companies into the ground, or God forbid sell an asset off to the foreigner, they'll collect their billions of dollars in bonuses and that, but they don't care about the jobs here in Australia. But I'm not going to sit here and whinge the whole 15 minutes. I know I've done a fair bit of whinging, so I will move forward on how we get manufacturing back into this country. If we want to rebuild manufacturing in this country, first and foremost, we need baseload energy, cheap and efficient baseload energy. And I noticed that Senator Green didn't mention the coal workers once, or the gas workers, because that's what stinks about this so-called reconstruction fund, is that the coal miners, coal mines and gas mines and the pipelines to pump gas around the country, something that we have a natural advantage of in this country, has been excluded from this fund. And if you are really serious about getting manufacturing back on its feet in this country, we need cheap, reliable energy. There's 400 million tonnes of coal out there near my hometown of Chinchilla, sitting in the ground, that is owned by the people of Queensland. It is free, except for the cost of production. And it is very cheap to produce. It is right at the ground level. It is what they call a mine mouth. The power station is known as a mine mouth power station, in the sense that the coal mine is right next to the power station. The power station sits next to the southern interconnector that sends electricity to New South Wales and Victoria. It is the cheapest energy in Australia, as per the Finkel report in 2017. And we could put up a couple of turbines there. We could put up a nuclear power station up to the north of Chinchilla there, just outside of Chinchilla in Barracool State Forest. It's the biggest state forest in the southern hemisphere, and we can get cheap and reliable baseload energy, coal, gas, nuclear energy. That would, we have got a competitive advantage in that worldwide. And we need that competitive advantage because we can't compete with countries like China and that on wages because we have a higher standard of living, and we should never sacrifice a higher standard of living. But if we want to be competitive, we have to produce. Now, the next thing we need to do is to start rewarding those people who actually produce goods and services in this country. We've got an obscene tax structure in this country called payroll tax that actually taxes the employer to employ people. Now, I suggest we bring back a stamp duty on share trading, and the money raised from share trading is used to fund the abolition of payroll tax in this country. It is absolutely absurd that, first of all, we tax people to employ people. We have 6 different payroll tax rates in this country, 6 different threshold levels. I mean, anyone that's actually trying to do payroll tax in this country, it's a compliance nightmare. But not only that, it adds to the cost of business. Now, we've got this absurdity in this country that we charge stamp duty on real assets like houses and businesses and farmland, but we don't charge stamp duty on paper assets. And 40 to 50% of the Australian stock market is traded by high-frequency foreign traders who come in and scalp the market. Okay? That sort of rubbish, where we have the day traders and the speculators, we're rewarding them by not having stamp duty on share trading. Right? We've got to stop rewarding speculators and start rewarding the producers. Because let me tell you this, freedom comes from prosperity. Freedom is the child of affluence, and prosperity comes from productivity. And it's the producers, the workers in this country that have made this country great. It is the workers in this country who have built this country. They bled for this country, and they are the ones that should be rewarded. And last but not least, we need to fix up our withholding tax structure in this country. Now, I was attacked by none other than the Treasurer when I was a Senate candidate because I made the bold assertion that we should raise withholding taxes on offshore profits. Now, what we've got in this country is a company tax rate of 30 cents, and depending on tax treaty, withholding tax rates are between 0 and 15. That gives multinationals who use foreign capital a tax advantage over domestic capital. And that's because, effectively, if you make $100 here and you're a multinational, you can set up a marketing hub like BHP or Rio did, or there's plenty of other Chevron, and you can pay all your profits, what they're called above-line profits, offshore. So you take General Motors. When we were all complaining about how General Motors was broke, did anyone ever ask the question, how much in interest, royalties and rent did General Motors pay offshore back to Detroit? And you know how much it was? It was enough to make sure they never made a profit in this country, because if they made a profit here, they would get pay 30 cents on the dollar every dollar of profit. But by shipping those profits offshore with the states, our withholding tax rates, there is no withholding tax rate on profits sent back to Detroit. I doubt the money went back to Detroit. It would have sat in a tax haven. And I'm glad to say that a few years ago the tax office picked up Chevron for messing around with transfer pricing. They tried to charge an interest rate, Chevron in the US tried to charge an interest rate here of 9% to its local subsidiary, when the real market interest rate was a 2% interest rate. So what we want to do, if we want to fix up our competitive nature in our manufacturing industry, is to make sure that we raise withholding taxes and lower onshore tax rates as well as income tax, because we should never lower company tax before we lower income tax. But we've got to make it more competitive to encourage companies to retain their earnings onshore here in Australia, because retained earnings is equity, and equity is title. And as a sovereign country, we must maintain title of our assets because we owe that to our children. That is why I ran for politics, is to make sure our children get the same opportunities as our forefathers gave to us. We cannot do that without a manufacturing industry, but we cannot do that when we have all these middlemen in the middle pocketing the profits in their back pocket. Thank you.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.